Well, thank you everyone for inviting me to speak about the collaborative work I've been involved with on global cotton connections of the Derwent Valley during Black History Month. I want to say a couple of things about the approach I want to take. Presenting on issues of enslavement during Black History Month can be problematic. Black History Month exists to celebrate Black achievement and to highlight the importance of Black history. The history of enslavement is only one part of Black history, as work on the great civilizations of Africa and recent work on Black British history highlights. Also, enslavement is not just Black history. It's an unevenly shared Black and white history. So my talk will cover the entangled, uneven Black and white histories of slavery relating to the Strutts family cotton mills, but with a focus on Black contributions and achievements in two ways. The historical achievements and contributions made by enslaved African people to the Strutts cotton textile business, and the achievements of people of African descent in making that contribution known in the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site Visitor Centre at Cromford Mills. So this is what I'm hoping to cover in the next 30 or so minutes. Give you an insight into the approach we've adopted, then look at a section on the historical contribution of the enslaved, and that will be the main part of the talk, looking at producers of raw cotton supplies, the role of enslavers, and a case study of the enslaved workers of a particular plantation, Mount Pleasant in Carriacou. And then I'll end with a shorter section on the achievements of people of African and African Caribbean descent in bringing ancestors' voices to the Derwent Valley Mills, and draw a couple of conclusions. So, just to say something about the approach to start with. In 2014, I joined with the Black-led community engagement organisation Bright Ideas Nottingham and local volunteers of African Caribbean heritage to set up the Nottingham Slave Trade Legacies initiative. The initiative was established to further understanding of Britain's connections to historical transatlantic slavery, to enhance the telling of these histories in heritage sites, and to empower, sorry, that shouldn't have happened, and to empower African Caribbean descendant communities in these processes and in making visits to rural heritage sites. It's been informed by the challenges of decentering white perspectives and avoiding interpretation practices which replicate colonial and enslaving attitudes, including in the selection of historical storylines, images, and words. Drawing on funding from the AHRC and the Heritage Lottery Fund, the initiative worked in the Derwent Valley Mills, examining the global cotton connections of the area's early rural cotton textile industry by drawing on archival and secondary research. So this was a project funded by the AHRC called Global Cotton Connections. We worked in collaboration with the World Heritage Site team and small heritage organisations and their mill sites, most notably the Arkwright Society. And the first round of funding that we had coincided with the late stages of the development of the new visitor centre for the World Heritage Site at Cromford Mills. And the second round of funding in 2017-18 with the further development of the centre. And we engaged with that process quite late in the day, but we managed to move from advisors to core creators of heritage materials in the later phase. As Rosemary's already explained, our early work focused quite strongly on a case study of the Strutt family who were co-investors, as most of you know, with the more famous Richard Arkwright at Cromford, the claimed site of the world's first successful water-driven cotton spinning mill. By the early 19th century, the Strutts were the country's leading cotton spinners, with mills at Belper, Milford and Derby. And they were a good case study to use because they have substantial business records for the late 18th and early 19th century, when the Derwent Valley was at the height of its importance in relation to their business. So I want to go on now to look at the example, to look at the first phase of what I want to talk about, which is the historical contribution of the enslaved to the cotton industry of the Strutts. And I want to do this by looking at the producers of the Strutts' raw cotton supplies. So a key task that we did at the start of the project was to examine where raw cotton supplies came from. And we drew here initially on a much earlier and classic study of the Strutts and the Arkwrights from the late 1950s by economic historians Fitton and Wadsworth. This includes raw cotton supply information in terms of bags from 1794 to 1817. With annual information on bags of cotton purchased and the types of cotton organised by broad geographic region and cotton type. From this, we undertook the relatively simple task of mapping and contextualising this in relation to histories of transatlantic slavery. And this map shows the overall view. So it shows the broad picture of where the Strutts were getting their raw cotton from. And it reveals Brazil to be a leading source of their raw cotton, with nearly half of their supplies coming from there, particularly from the Pernambuco and Maranhão provinces. And this may reflect their favouring of long staple cotton varieties for use in the mechanised spinning process. Just under a fifth came from the West Indies, with a similar amount from the modern area of Guyana and Suriname. The southern states of the USA, it wasn't the USA then, but of America, accounted for just over a tenth of the bags supplied, and the smaller amount came from the Indian subcontinent, just under 5%, with traces from other areas of South America and Europe. So from this, what can we say about the link to enslavement? Well, we can say that the vast majority of the Strutts' raw cotton supplies at this time came from sites where enslaved African labour was used to grow cotton. We did actually get into the archive and do a bit of work ourselves to complement that older data. And we used cotton ledger data available in the Derbyshire Record Office for a shorter time period from 1793 to 1798 to consider the origins of raw cotton based on weight. So, but a broadly similar picture emerges here in relation to the older bag data of Fitton and Wadsworth. But the importance of the West Indies is actually heightened when you look at the weight. It's almost as important a source area as South America. And the small island of Carriacou, which is part of Grenada, supplied almost a quarter of the Strutts' raw cotton at this time in the 1790s. So it was actually a tiny place, but really important for them. And that island had a reputation for growing good quality, and I think long staple cotton too. Raw cotton was first sourced from the American South by the Strutts in 1798, and it increased in importance from that time. It only shows up as a trace in the 1790s. And this pattern of use of supplies, this pattern of supplies used by the Strutts really reflects a wider pattern in the country at the time. I've put a slide up from Riello's book on cotton, which shows where cotton came from, imported into Britain more broadly. But I think the Strutts made more use of Brazilian and Carriacou cotton than the average. Okay. So I want to go on now to look at the role of enslavers, people who were involved in enslaving and who had held as their property enslaved people. And to look as well at the slave trade a bit. So that demand for raw cotton that we've just seen, coming from the Strutts and coming more broadly, was driving the transatlantic slave trade in part. And I've shown here an example from the slave trade to Brazil. So we can see evidence of the demand for raw cotton from Brazil driving the slave trade. Arrivals of enslaved Africans grew substantially in the northeast area of the country where cotton was grown from the 1750s, reaching peaks of just over 200,000 people in the later 18th and early 19th centuries up until the early 1820s. And one commentator has argued that white cotton turned Maranhão black, the province of Maranhão black. And an 1819 source reported that 2/3 of the population of Maranhão state was enslaved and located on cotton plantations. And we know that these were important areas for the Strutts. I've also looked at the connection to enslavers through the suppliers who sold the raw cotton to the Strutts. Now the Strutts imported via both London and Liverpool. And Liverpool was certainly second in importance, but it was important in the 1790s, particularly in 1798 and 1799. And I've done some analysis of the supplies from 1794 to 1802 and found that merchants involved in slave trading or slave ownership or ownership of enslaved people supplied over half of the cotton the Strutts imported via that port in that period. Okay. And the top three suppliers were substantial and well-known slave traders and plantation owners who built fortunes from these activities and opposed abolition. And these included quite well-known people like John Bolton and the Earl brothers, who are very well known, involved in many slave trading voyages and were plantation owners themselves. But I want to pick up on the third name in our supplier list, and that is Thomas Tarleton, a merchant. Show him. Merchant, cotton broker, slave trader, plantation owner, owner of enslaved people, and part of a family which actively opposed abolition. And he supplied about 11% of the cotton which the Strutts were importing via Liverpool between 1794 and 1802. And he supplied them just from Carriacou, where he actually held a plantation. So I've already said he was a property owner of plantations and enslaved African people. He owned a property on Carriacou and also another one in Dominica. And by 1790, he'd built a fortune which allowed him to buy a country estate, Bolesworth Castle in Cheshire. And he left £7,000 property when he died. And Tarleton was very involved also in slave trading. He undertook at least 84 slave trading voyages between 1774 and 1800, About 30 of them were to Grenada, which included Carriacou. And he was also speculating over lucrative voyages to Saint Dominique, Haiti, in 1790. And I've got an extract from a letter that he wrote speculating whether he'd be able to engage in the trade further there. Thomas Tarleton was also part of a family who were very strong lobbyists against abolition. And John Tarleton was nominated by Liverpool merchants to go to London to speak with the Prime Minister, William Pitt, in 1788 to lobby against the abolition of the slave trade, which was being promoted through Parliament at that time. And he makes this sort of argument about the damage that there would be to the trade in the whole of the country if the slave trade was abolished. And you can see him actively opposing William Wilberforce's plan for that. He also makes an argument that the slave trade was moral. And so I've got an extract from one of the letters in which he does this. He says, we rather than saying the slave trade is founded in blood, we can argue to prove the reverse, that the basis of it was founded in humanity and justice to the natives. So, you know, attitudes are really difficult to find any common feeling with, but they were being made by these suppliers of the Strutts in the 1790s and 1780s. So I want to go on and now focus more on the enslaved people who lived on Mount Pleasant. Tracing the lives of enslaved people is often challenging. They appear as numbers in the transatlantic slave trade database and the 1834 compensation records. Plantation inventories or management correspondence, including mortgages, might list them individually by name and value, as they were regarded as important assets for the plantation owner or moneylender. Unfortunately, though, no detailed plantation records have been found for Mount Pleasant in the Tarleton papers. But we do know from wider work on Carriacou by Ryden that the Mount Pleasant plantation was 509 acres in extent, and it was the second largest cotton producer on Carriacou in 1790, with 227 enslaved African people living there. The UCL Legacies of British Slave Ownership database also shows that the enslaved workforce increased to 256 by 1834, and that Tarleton's trustees were paid over £6,500 in compensation when slavery was abolished. Of course, the enslaved had no reparations. Wider work on cotton cultivation in Carriacou gives an insight into their working lives. So this is taken quite strongly from Ryden's work. Cotton was a less labour-intensive crop than rice or sugar, but there were particularly harsh conditions in the Deep South, perhaps less so in the Caribbean. Cotton production involved land preparation. It involved sowing the plants, cultivation, weeding and harvesting, drying, ginning, cleaning the dirt patches from lint, a process called moating, and packing. So it's quite a complicated process to produce cotton and pack it up for sending to Britain. Enslaved people typically worked a regime of 9 to 10 hours per day from sunrise to sunset. And they worked in field gangs, and there was a closely supervised field gang system in Carriacou, with first, second and third gangs often segregated by sex, and with children in the third gangs. And in terms of who did what, well, on the plantation, well, the managers were typically white, as were the overseers, but the drivers of the gangs were typically black, and the field gangs were obviously all enslaved African workers. So what sort of cultivation did they undertake? Well, there was a cycle of cultivation through the year. In June, they were clearing and preparing land for planting. In July and August, thinning. In September and October, thinning and pruning. Flowering occurred at the end of October. If the plants survived the hurricane season, pods appeared in November and December. And in December to March, the pods began to ripen and open, and harvesting was started. And harvesting had to be done at speed to avoid the damage that could come from heavy rain. And it was hard labour. It involved highly skilled action of speed and accuracy to avoid the prickly boles which lacerated hands and fingers, and to pick to the speed what was expected of the enslaved workers by the managers. And then post-harvest, the cotton was cleaned by the cotton gin and by hand, and enslaved people were involved in wrapping and baling of cotton. So that's given you an insight into some of the labour that enslaved people did. But how can we get an insight into the enslaved people themselves? Well, after the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807, plantation managers were required to make so-called slave registers of the enslaved to allow the British government to monitor the effectiveness of abolishing the slave trade. And these registers do exist for Mount Pleasant, and an example is shown here, or part of an example. It records males and females, categories of names, supposed ages, colour, country, conspicuous marks, and remarks which were made by the plantation manager. Now, so we can see a list by males and then females of enslaved people who worked and lived on Mount Pleasant. But of course, they're not these people's original names. They're not their African names. They're given names that they were given by their owners. And these names are mainly British in origin. You can see Andrew, I think, on the list. Some are classical, such as Ajax, again on the list. And a few names signify, a few people were named after the Tartans. One was called Tartan, one was called Banastri, a Tartan name. And a few names signify African origins, such as Igbo. The country category exists to distinguish people born in Africa from those born in the Caribbean, linked to regulating the slave trade. The conspicuous marks category exists to help identify enslaved people if they left the plantation. And these notes were used to track down runaways, for example. But the conspicuous marks category also gives insights into origins in Africa, where the marking of faces, a form of tattooing, I think, was a common practice. So you can see country marks on his face is noted on this extract of someone who was born in Africa. Analysis of the 1825 register allows for some further details of the enslaved Africans of Mount Pleasant to be revealed. I've done a bit of analysis, but I think I could do more here. 55% were female, which reflects the importance enslavers ascribed to women as prime plantation workers in field gangs, also domestic workers, but also importantly as reproducers of the enslaved population after the end of the slave trade, when you couldn't just buy in more people. the 45% of men, of males worked as artisans, drivers, and in the field gangs. Children made up 31% of the enslaved population in 1825, which is quite a high proportion. They started work at a young age in the third gang. Around 15% of all the people were all over 30 were born in Africa. And that includes high proportions of the oldest people. So you can see in the over 60s categories, larger numbers of them being African born, larger proportions. The register also gives us some insights into injuries and health, which allow us to think about the dangers of plantation life. And they might also refer to enslaved people who had left the plantation, as is the case here with this extract, which shows a comment about William, who's a runaway, has been run away since the last general registration, it says. And this gives us an insight into one form of resistance to slavery, running away. Other forms included slow working, infanticide to refuse the reproduction of slavery, growing and selling your food to buy yours or your children's freedom, and rebellion. We know a little more about resistance of the enslaved on Mount Pleasant through the work of Abigail Bernard, whose ancestor York was enslaved on the plantation. In looking for her ancestor, she found evidence of enslaved life on Mount Pleasant and resistance to it. And she found that there were 3 enslaved men who absconded, Gregoire, Antoine, and Dan, and sailed to the main island of Grenada and complained to the governor there that they were being ill-treated and had inadequate food on Mount Pleasant. So they were heard, but the manager came and defended the position and said that they were actually very lazy people and they were ringleaders of a very turbulent group of enslaved people. And the result was that I think Gregoire and Antoine were both sent to Trinidad, banished to Trinidad. And there's a sense here that actually there was quite a lot of trouble going on Thomas Tarleton's estate over a number of years. These were people who resisted slavery, and we know this because of Abigail Bernard's work. Okay. So in my final section, I want to just reflect on some of the achievements of people of African and African Caribbean descent in bringing their ancestors' voices to the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site. The map data has been integrated into the Visitor Centre at Cromford since its opening in 2016. And this was a really important achievement for the project, the Global Cotton Connections project, and for the Slave Trade Legacies volunteers, who on their first visit to Cromford Mills in 2014 were told no more of the origins of raw cotton supplies than that they came on pack horse from Liverpool. So it was a real achievement for the group to see the maps which showed a wider picture of where the Strutts, at least, were getting their cotton from. A second achievement of the group was to be involved in proposing a brief for a workers' mural, which was installed in the valley, the Global Workers' Mural, as it's come to be known, which includes enslaved African plantation workers, women, children, and men harvesting raw cotton in the Americas. It also includes the mill workers from the Derwent Valley and Indian weavers whose livelihoods were impacted by the rise of the Derwent Valley cotton industry. And many of you may know the mural won an award for the artist Brian Gallagher in the World Illustration Awards. And what the the part of the mural that focuses on the enslaved African workers seeks to work against 18th century conventions. It foregrounds workers, it includes a sense of labour, it signals the enforced nature of African workers on the plantation through including an overseer, and it suggests the skill of the cotton pickers. But there is a disappointment for the group, in particular about the mural, that it's actually hidden. Because it was a late addition to the design, it's actually been placed behind a graphicized glass wall showing the names of mill owners and machines. And the group feel you can't really see it properly, and were quite outspoken in their criticism of this element. The volunteers, the Slave Trade Legacy volunteers and the Global Cotton Connections project were invited to produce a new panel in 2017, which was installed at Cromford Mills in 2018 in the Visitor Centre. And the Slave Trade Legacy volunteers led on a section entitled Ancestors' Voices. This includes co-produced panel text and images telling the story of their connections to the cotton trade, and an audio station recording representing the priorities, language and insights of the African Caribbean Slave Trade Legacy volunteers. And this panel is not hidden away. As well as their selected words and images, the voices of the Slave Trade Legacy volunteers can be heard celebrating their ancestors in song and poetry, reading accounts of enslaved life based on historical autobiographies, and also testifying why it's important to them to be able to tell their ancestors' stories. And there's a listening station that you can listen to those stories on. I think my final slide is about the centre, the Visitor Centre, is to show how the collaboration with Abigail Bernard, pictured here, and her cousin Daniel Shade and her mother, how the collaboration and their research on their ancestor York Kwashi from Mount Pleasant enabled us to include in the Visitor Centre a living link to the past, and use a map provided by the Carriacou Museum in the Caribbean in the actual Visitor Centre display, and you can see it down at the bottom of the panel. And we also included an extract from the register which showed their ancestor York on the register. And this is a very powerful way of conveying a living link to the past. So I just want to draw a few conclusions. Firstly, enslaved African people were vital contributors to the Strutts cotton business in the Derwent Valley through their provision of the majority of the raw cotton used in the mills. They are not peripheral to its success. Secondly, the Strutts' demand for raw cotton from the Americas had the effect of supporting the transatlantic slave trade and extending it, and extending slavery and the condition of slavery for thousands of African people. And this is really despite evidence that is in the archive and is popularly held or popularly known, that the Strutt family held abolitionist views. Now, they did have connections with abolitionists and with some people who were very involved in promoting slavery, but the general picture is that they were more sympathetic to abolition. And finally, people of African descent today have been vital to the development of understanding the contribution of their enslaved ancestors to the Derwent Valley and the attempts of their enslaved ancestors to survive and resist enslavement. And I think it's really important that the descendant groups have really been able to bring those stories to the public through the visitor centre. And my final slide is just to thank the people who've helped with the research. Helen Bates, particularly on the historical side, together with Larry Jones, but all the staff in the heritage sites and all the volunteers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanne. We've got one or two questions. I assume I can be heard? I hope I can be. We've got one or two questions already there for you, so I thought I'd just start. You can probably see them again. Are you okay to look through them, or do you want me to?
Yeah, let me. Shall I start at the top?
Start at the top. Steve's technical hints.
Okay. Our full. The first one was our full transcripts.
Sorry, do you want to just explain what that is? So
the slave compensation registers. Okay, the slave compensation registers are in the National Archives. They have been worked on by the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project based at UCL in London, and the database allows you to search for the details. I don't think they have put the verbatim details of the registers on that site. I might be wrong, but they do. You can access them through the National Archives, but I don't think they've been transcribed from the National Archive. Okay, what was the ethnic background of managers and supervisors of the plantation? I think they were, I don't know the answer to that for Mount Pleasant, but it was quite common to send out people from Britain to work on the plantations, rather than them being people who had for generations lived in the colonies, and particularly in a more newer colony like Carriacou, which had only come into British ownership after the 7 Years' War in the 1760s. Then it was common for people to send someone out to be a manager. And in fact, one of the people I mentioned, John Bolton, the Liverpool merchant and slave trader, he had done that early in his career. He has a rags to riches sort of story. He goes out to work in the Caribbean for about 10 years and built up a fortune. But he's working more in the mercantile trade rather than on a plantation. But yeah, I think it was mixed, but there were definitely people who came out from Britain. Okay, the Strutts were Unitarians. What did they know of this and what did they think about it? Well, yes, they knew. I don't think they couldn't know that they were dealing with someone like Tarleton. Their family was well known as a pro-slavery family. They argued against abolition publicly. The Strutts would have known that. That did not stop them trading with Bolton and with Tarleton and all the Boltons. The reputations would have been known, and there's evidence that Joseph Strutt's wife, her brother, went to West Africa to work in for the company of merchants trading to Africa in the 1790s. And a letter she writes sort of, I think she's concerned that her brother needs to find employment, and she says he's going to trade in ivory, gold dust, and then she says also, unfortunately, human beings. And so there's a sense that she was expressing regret at that, but it didn't stop her brother from going. And I think I want to look a bit further into that correspondence. They certainly, members of the family are certainly later arguing for abolition in the 1820s and 1830s, abolition of slavery, and there's no evidence that they were active. Well, I've not found them investing in slave ships or owning plantations, but I just think they knew about this. They couldn't not know about it. This link to Mount Pleasant, yeah, someone else had told me about that. I don't know. It would be interesting to know more about whether there was any link to that name. It's quite a commonly used sort of name, Mount Pleasant. So in the Caribbean, there are a number of plantations that are called Mount Pleasant. But what I did find was that there is an area of Liverpool called Mount Pleasant. And I think that is directly linked to the Tartan's ownership of Mount Pleasant. So I'm just scrolling down. Okay. So I've concentrated on slavery from the Caribbean with little mention of Guyana and other South American areas. Oh, yeah, the reason for that was because we tried to find an example whether we could trace a direct connection to a particular plantation. And it was through Tartan that we managed to do that. I couldn't do that through the other main suppliers of cotton to the Strutts. So yeah, that's the only reason. I could have, if I got the data information, I could have talked about what cotton production was like in other parts of the world, like Guyana and Brazil.
I think, Susanne, perhaps what people are talking about is, that people here probably know more about America, but are perhaps totally unaware that huge numbers of people in South America were enslaved, and that Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery.
Rather than why I'm concentrating, that people don't realise there was this huge slave trade to South America. That it's not just a Caribbean and North American phenomenon. And there's a large body of work on that slave trade. And of course, that slave trade goes on much later into the 19th century, I think until the 1840s. And so you've got people using cotton. The Brazilian supply dries up a bit in the 1820s, and America obviously becomes much more dominant. But you do get people using supplies from places where the slave trade hasn't been abolished after we've abolished the slave trade, the British slave trade, if that makes sense. I can see a question from Karen. What were the names of the suppliers? Were the names of the suppliers clearly identified in the archive? They were, yes, they were in the ledgers. So it was, whether it's totally clear. Yeah, it was quite clear. It was, I think that's maybe quite unusual. They were in the, so again, maybe that suggests, that the Strutts, in their own ledgers, they were writing the names Bolton, Tartan, Earl. What do we say about the contribution of enslaved people at North Mill? Well, I can say a little bit about that. I think when we started off in 2014 doing the work, I think North Mill was one of the places where the volunteers were relieved to find something about the history of enslavement and something about so I think there were some images of cotton plantations and something about where the supplies of cotton came from, and there was some information about India as well. But Rosemary might be better placed to answer that question than me.
It isn't hugely prominent, I must say, but there's also something to do with the song as well. It's really, but it isn't. It's really to do with, yes, raw materials and where they come from. It's not hugely prominent as a labour force, shall we say, and what that means. So it is an aspect that needs to be developed quite a lot more.
So someone said the slave registers are available on Ancestry. Yeah, the slave those so-called slave registers are on Ancestry. It's the compensation records that are in the National Archive. The registers are also there, but they've been transcribed onto Ancestry, which I think is where we got them from. Did the source of cotton supply change after abolition? I think that might depend on abolition of what? The slave trade, the British slave trade, slavery in the British colonies. Then you've got the Brazilian slave trade, the Brazilian slavery. Was it after it was abolition of the Brazilian slave trade? So I don't think the histories of the slave trade and abolition impacted so heavily here. I think the shift to the southern states as a main supply area occurs because there's a shift elsewhere to more lucrative focus on sugar in Carriacou, for example. That's what happens. They shift to sugar from cotton, and then there's the cheapness of the American cotton because of they can grow cotton more cheaply, and the types of cotton they then start producing are ones that can be more easily used as the mechanization process develops and shorter staple cotton can be used. And then there's the cotton ginning process. I think they're the reasons why the southern states have become more important. But of course that's Britain abolishes its own slavery in its own colonies, but imports American cotton, which is being produced by enslaved people. Strutt was a partner of the Arkwright. Yeah, okay. Arkwright. So less sources available on Arkwright, but I have looked at his account with Nicholas Waterhouse in Liverpool. From about 1798 to about 1801, and he's using the Boltons and Bolton and the Earls, but not Tarleton. Actually, he doesn't import from Carriacou, it looks like, but he's using well-known slave traders as well to source his cotton at that time. But that's Richard Arkwright Jr. I don't have any records from the earlier period, but Fitton and Wadsworth sort of make an argument that the Strutts and the Arkwrights did use similar brokers, and they were likely to have used similar sources. There's no evidence that either family invested directly in plantations. There is evidence that Richard Arkwright Sr. and Walter Evans invested a small amount of money in the Sierra Leone project, which was an abolitionist project to try and encourage production of different crops in Africa, and was set up to try and avoid the slave trade. But we don't know what their motivation for that was, whether it was trying to get better cotton supplies or whether it was an abolitionist sort of motivation. But it's quite interesting that the Strutts don't invest. They're not investors, and that's around 1791. What alternatives were there to using cotton produced by enslaved people? So there are alternatives from using cotton from India, for example, from the Levant area, the areas of modern Turkey, but these were areas where people could be subjected to enforced labour, but not enslaved as chattel slaves. So there were some alternatives, but the argument I've heard is that the early technology was much more suited to long staple cotton, and that was what was being produced in places like Brazil and not in places like India and the Levant, and that might have had a strong bearing. But there doesn't seem to be a very active campaign like there is with sugar to really set up non-slavery related production. It doesn't seem to be strongly there. Okay, yeah. In reality, were there any alternatives? So there is a small free cotton movement that starts up in the 1840s, and it's very small and it's very complicated. Unlike the free sugar movement, which does sort of take off, and sugar boycotts take off, free cotton movements and cotton boycotts don't really seem to take off. There is a small movement. There's some commissioning of, I think, Manchester mill producers to take in free labour cotton from America and to produce a small range of goods which were distributed through particular networks, sort of specialist sort of networks of more middle class women. Okay, so there was a small movement, but it just didn't take off. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Okay, many people. Yeah. I think I showed the picture, the painting of Thomas Tarleton's father, John Tarleton, which is by Joseph Wright. And Joseph Wright spent a part of his life, he went to Liverpool and met a whole range of Liverpool merchants at that time. So yeah, Joseph Wright made money out of painting people who were involved in the slave trade. Yeah, I didn't know he was an abolitionist. That's interesting view. Sorry, I'm having trouble scrolling down. Let's see if I can do that bit. Was there any more after that? Is that the last one?
There's a question about were the families, Joseph Wright painted both Strutt and Tarleton, were the two families close in any way? I suppose that means Strutt and Tarleton.
Yeah, haven't found anything. Yeah, I mean, there'll probably be more experts in the audience on Joseph Wright of Derby than me, but you know, he did go to Liverpool for a while in his life. I don't think it's really clearly known why he went there, and he painted a whole range of mercantile society in Liverpool, slave traders and not. So I don't think that signifies there was a connection, a personal connection between the Strutts and the Tarletons. It's something that's intriguing to find out about their personal networks. There seem to be more personal connections with abolitionists than people like Tarleton, but there's a few things to follow up there.
You see your last questions about was the finished cotton cloth exported back to the slave producing areas, for example, for clothing the enslaved? In earlier times, Osnabrück cloth was sent out to Jamaica.
Yeah.
So did it go back the other way?
Yeah, there's some evidence of that. So one of the things I cut out of my talk was some letters to a merchant, Thomas Augier from Charleston, and he was sourcing raw cotton for the Strutts, and they were sending hosiery out, and some of the proceeds from the hosiery were used to buy raw cotton. But I think so there's a bit of evidence of that going on, and I think they sent out hosiery to Rio as well, Rio de Janeiro, and So there's sort of fragmentary evidence for that. But what I've been doing is trying to trace who they sold their thread to. So, because they were mainly in the early 19th century producing thread. So I've looked at who they were selling to in Nottingham, and they're actually selling thread to people who later become quite prominent abolitionists. So yeah, and then the idea would be to trace where those people sold their products to, but I haven't got that far. But so I think there's a small direct trade, but mainly they're selling into thread into markets in Britain.
Susanne, just to go back to some of those registers that are in the Strutt archive, which do identify where the bales come from, what you can see there is the Strutt quality control. I think, you know, what they're being used for is they're very carefully measuring and counting, you know, the weight of the stones and things in the bag, you know, what the real weight of the contents is. And when you look at those ledgers, they go from the bale right through to the final, you know, how many yards of thread and what have you, and this immense calculation. So I think the Strutt's concern is huge on quality control and price and what you get out of the bale, and then, as you say, they're then, you know, concentrating on certain lengths of cotton that's doing what they need the long staple on. But I mean, that aspect of their business is something that comes through the registers very clearly. This immense calculation of machinery and cost from go to woe, you know, it's an extraordinary part of the business, and I think might have been more important to them than anything else. But,
I mean, of the correspondence that I've read in the ledgers, there's lots about trying to get the best price for raw cotton. They're trying to keep their prices low, so they can, you know, to make the profit, but they also want the quality. So there's quite a lot of comment about certain places, like they didn't like Jamaica, it had very yellow cotton, so they didn't like that. And there's comments about, you know, some of it being very dirty. So I think the reputation of maybe the supplier and where it's coming from was important.
Susanne, I think that's the end of your questions. Thank you very much indeed. For the audience, if you'd like to contact Susanne, her contact details are on the University of Nottingham website. And she's also going to be a speaker at the Arkwright Society's annual Industrial Revolution Conference, which is also by Zoom and takes place on Saturday the 7th of November. So if you're interested in that, the details are on the Cromford Mills website. And there'll be other links that we'll be putting up on the World Heritage Site website and on the Strutts North Mill website as well. So we hope that we'll continue this conversation in all sorts of different ways by making other information and the links to Susanne's work available for you. And I think if you Google global cotton connections, that comes up very easily for the previous work. Thank you to everybody for joining us. My thanks to Steve Hill of the Arkwright Society, who's done the technology. Thank you, Steve, very much.